Chapter 5. The Trial. The next couple of weeks were busy, especially for Dad. By this time, Robert and I had returned from staying with the Lewises, and not a day went by when we weren't visited by somebody. Civil rights activists, well-wishers, newspaper reporters, and photographers would come to the cotton fields to interview Dad and to take pictures. Even a television crew came out one day. This was the first time I had ever seen a television camera. All of this attention helped us get through those dark days without Bobo. About a week after Bobo's body was discovered, we received a different kind of visitor. An official from Tallahatchie County came to our home with papers saying that we were to report to Sumner to give depositions in the case. I didn't know what a deposition was, I just knew that we had to go up to Sumner and talk to the lawyers there. After presenting the summonses, the man pulled out a ring that had been found on the body and asked Dad if he recognized it. I spoke up, "That's Bobo's ring." I also remember one day when members of the NAACP came to the house, including the state's field representative, Medgar Evers. It was Medgar's task to round up prosecution witnesses for the upcoming trial, and he didn't have too much time to get it done. Also working to find and secure witnesses was Dr. T.R.M. Howard, a beloved African-American physician from historic Mountain Bayou, Mississippi, a town populated and governed entirely by blacks. We were so proud of Dr. Howard, who would not be intimidated by whites or the Klan. It was through the tireless efforts of Dr. Howard and Medgar Evers that Mamie was prepared to testify about identifying her son's body, and a surprise witness to the crime itself was located. An 18-year-old black man named Willie Reed said that he had heard screams coming from a barn on a plantation managed by J.W. Milam's brother Leslie. Then, Reed said, he was accosted by J.W. Milam, who asked him if had heard or seen anything. He had enough sense not to let on at the time how much he had witnessed. Medgar and Dad had a long conversation, and I later learned that Medgar had congratulated Dad for his courage in agreeing to testify. Prosecutors needed him to identify Bryant and Milam as the men who took Bobo. Medgar stressed that Dad should work to retain as much of his memory of what had happened as possible and speak only the truth. Milam had threatened my dad on the night of the abduction, telling him that if he said anything at all to incriminate them, he would never live to see his next birthday. Our neighbors were warning Dad to be careful, and many people sent telegrams urging him to leave the state. But he was determined to stay and to fight. He said it wasn't something he chose to do, but something he felt he had to do. When I myself was subpoenaed to be a witness at the trial, I must admit that I was a little bit nervous. But I saw the courage my father was displaying, and it was all the encouragement I needed. If he wasn't afraid, then I wasn't either. Even at this early age, it was my belief that if we had to go down, then we would go down fighting. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam's murder trial began on Monday, September 19, a little less than 3 weeks after Bobo's body was dredged from the river. They were being tried up in Tallahatchie County, where the body was found. Our neighbor John Crawford fearlessly agreed to drive us to the courthouse in Sumner every day. We'd leave for court around 8 in the morning and get there by 9. After we got to the old brick courthouse, I was escorted to a witness room at the back of the courtroom, where I was told to wait to be called. There were no sheriff's deputies there to protect us, but that was no surprise to Dad. On the first day, Maurice and Robert were there in the witness room with me, but they had to go back to the cotton field, so they couldn't stay. Most of the time I was alone, although sometimes my father or other witnesses were there with me. From the room, I could vaguely hear what was going on in the trial. At one time I heard Medgar Evers's name called, but I wasn't sure why. It may have been when the court's clerk was merely noting the people slated to testify in the case. While I was not able to actually watch much of the trial, during the recess or when they took breaks, I was allowed to go outside the courthouse and see all the people milling around on the courthouse lawn. There were hundreds there, as though the state fair were about to open. Recesses were also my chance to escape the heat and humidity of the courtroom. The overhead fans provided very little relief, especially in the witness room where I was. I might go to the nearby store to buy a pop or a candy bar. There were no restaurants where a black person could buy lunch. Upon entering the courtroom again after recess, I could see Bryant and Milam on the far side with their wives and children, including Carolyn Bryant. They seemed to be having a good time, laughing and talking with friends and relatives who had come to give them moral support. As my eyes quickly scanned the crowd, I also noticed the Tallahatchie County Sheriff, H.C. Strider, who at nearly 300 pounds was pretty hard to miss. Everybody knew the sheriff was a big landowner with a large number of black sharecroppers, and airplanes that flew over the cotton fields dusting them with chemicals. It was his duty to search everybody as they entered the courtroom. I don't think any of the white people were searched, just the blacks. There were reports that he had received a lot of threatening letters, so I guess he wasn't taking any chances. Like everything else in Mississippi at that time, it was a segregated courtroom. White men occupied most of the 100 or so seats. What black spectators there were, and there must have been 40 or 50, were confined to the back of the courtroom. The reporters there covering the trial were also separated by race. They were instructed by Judge Curtis Swungo that there were to be no pictures taken during the trial, so they were to get all their pictures before the session began. Most of what occurred in the courtroom during the 5-day trial was told to me by Dad later in the evenings as we drove home with Mr. Crawford. Nothing much happened on the first day. From what I could gather, most of the time was given to selecting the jury. More than 100 potential jurors were called before they decided on 10 white men. 2 more white men would be selected on Tuesday. One of the reasons it took so long, Dad told me, was that so many of the potential jurors had contributed money for the defense, and some of them were relatives of the defense lawyers. I was curious to know if any of them were related to the prosecutors, Gerald Chatham and Robert B. Smith III. If convicted of murder, Bryant and Milam faced life in prison. The death penalty was never mentioned, much to Dad's disgust. But the defense was doing all it could to argue the body taken from the river was not Bobo. No autopsy had been conducted to confirm his identity. I never knew exactly why, and while Bryant and Milam admitted to abducting him, they insisted they had not harmed him. They claimed they had let him go after Mrs. Bryant said he wasn't the one who had insulted her that day. They were not only murderers, they were lying wonders. Some of their supporters went so far as to claim that the NAACP had planted the body to further its own agenda. So Chatham and Smith had to show that what the defense was saying was untrue. That was the main reason I had been called as a witness, to confirm that the ring that was found on the body was Bobo's. The prosecutors were not interested in what happened at the store or our encounter with Carolyn Bryant. I found it odd that they didn't ask me about that. As it turned out, I never took the stand to testify, because they focused on Mamie's testimony instead. I think she arrived on the second day of the trial, accompanied by her father, John Carthen, Rayfield Moody, her cousin and a union leader in Chicago, and Charles Diggs, an African-American congressman from the state of Michigan. There was a lot of commotion when Mamie entered the courtroom. Breaking all protocol, the photographers rushed to take her picture, and reporters both black and white swarmed around her, asking her questions about her son and what she hoped to add to the trial proceedings. After things quieted down, I stood before the judge with Mamie and the other witnesses who had been called to identify Bobo's body. He reassured us that we would be treated fairly and that the Sheriff's Department of Tallahatchie County would protect us. Looking back, I know that we had no protection but the mercy of God. If somebody had tried to harm us, I don't think the sheriff would have done anything to prevent it. At the time, though, I somehow believed what the judge was saying. Even so, I was a little nervous with so many white people crowding around us, staring at us, but never saying anything to us. The judge, the jury, the lawyers, the audience, just about everyone was white. Medgar Evers was in and out of the trial, though, and I remembered seeing Congressman Diggs, sweltering in the hot and humid courtroom with the rest of us. And despite my apprehension, I was certain that Bryant and Milam were going to be convicted, since there were eyewitnesses who had pointed them out, including my father. I will never forget that Wednesday, the third day of the trial, because that was the day Dad took the stand as the state's first witness. He was on the witness stand for about half an hour. There were the usual questions. District Attorney Chatham asked Dad to state his name and where he lived. He asked Dad where money was in relation to the town of Phillip, where Bobo's body was found, and how long he had lived there. Whose place did he live on? What kind of house did he live in? How many rooms? Dad was then asked to describe the layout of the house. He was asked about the night of the abduction. Who was in the house with him? Did one or more person visit his home that night, and if they did, at what time? Dad answered in a booming voice, letting the court know that he wasn't intimidated, he wasn't afraid. Dad described how the kidnappers had come to the front door at around 2 a.m. and how Bryant had introduced himself. Then the DA asked Dad to point out the other man with Bryant that night, if he saw him in the courtroom. Dad stood up, pointed to Milam, and said, "There he is." The photographers couldn't resist taking pictures. I've seen those photos of Dad so many times, with his finger pointed at the accused, that I forget that I was in the witness room and not in the courtroom. Dad later said that while the few blacks in the courtroom were in agreement with him, the whites stared at him. He said that he stared back. From the looks on their faces, Dad knew that he had to leave Mississippi. It was the first time in the history of the state, we were told later, that a black man had stood up in a courtroom and accused a white man of anything. Riding back home with him later that day, I felt extremely proud. One night soon after Dad testified, we boys were staying with neighbors and Dad was at home all alone. He went to bed, he told us, but could not sleep. He was so restless he decided to spend the night at his church. While there, he said, a spirit of fear came over him. That helped him to make up his mind that when the trial was over, it would be time to go. Another factor that helped him make the decision to move was that he knew Mama wasn't coming back. She was completely devastated by what had happened to Bobo, and I don't think she ever got over it. None of us did. Every day of the trial was important to us, but many people feel that the fourth day was especially crucial. The courtroom was as packed as ever as Mamie took the stand. With tears in her eyes, she told the court how she identified her son's body in Chicago at A. Rayner and Sons Funeral Home, where it had been sent for burial. I had been unable to attend the funeral, no one from Mississippi had gone, but we heard about it from my sister Hallie. She said it was a very sad affair and that she did all she could do to keep from fainting. A lot of people just keeled over after viewing Bobo's disfigured remains in the open casket. After Mamie stepped down, the prosecution called surprise witness Willie Reed. He testified to what he had seen on the day Bobo was abducted. J.W. Milam leaving the barn where Reed had heard screams. Under questioning by prosecutor Robert Smith, Reed also reported that earlier, when he was on his way to the store, he had seen a green and white truck pass him, with 4 white men in the cab and 3 black men in the back, one of them sitting down in the truck bed. Reed testified that the seated person resembled the picture of Emmett Till that he later saw in the paper. After a few more witnesses, the state rested its case. The first witness for the defense was Carolyn Bryant. She had been at the trial every day, but now she was on the stand to recall what had happened in town the Wednesday before the abduction. The prosecution objected that her story was not relevant to the case, and Judge Swango agreed, so she wasn't allowed to testify in front of the jury. But the judge let her tell her story for the record without the jury being present, and without being under oath. So she couldn't be cross-examined, and if she lied, she couldn't be charged with perjury. She told the court that Bobo had grabbed her and spoken lasciviously to her, but as I mentioned, he was alone with her for less than a minute, there was a counter separating them, and he did nothing inappropriate while I was with him in the store. We all were in the courtroom on Friday morning for the final day of the trial, as the state and the defense delivered their closing arguments. The defense dwelled on 2 claims by their expert witnesses, that because the body was so badly decomposed, it could not be identified as Bobo's, and that it had to have been in the river 10 to 15 days, more than the 3 Bobo had been missing. These same witnesses had been forced to admit on cross-examination that a body might decompose faster if it had been badly beaten. The prosecution's response to these arguments was powerful and widely circulated. Mr. Chatham remembered a day when his son had come to him and told him, "Dad, I found old Shep, his dead dog." His son took him by the hand and led him to a ravine where the dog's badly decomposed body was rotting in the sun. That dog's body was rotting and the meat was falling off of its bone, Chatham told a packed courthouse, but my little boy pointed to it and said, "That's Old Shep, Pennsylvania. That's Old Shep." Chatham said that his son did not need an undertaker to identify his dog, and Mamie didn't need one to identify Bobo. "All we need is someone who loved and cared for him," he said. "If there was one ear left, one hairline, one part of his nose, any part of Emmett Till's body, then I say to you that Mamie Bradley was God's given witness to identify him." Mr. Chatham did a marvelous job throughout the state's summation, telling stories with such passion that it brought tears to listeners' eyes. We all agreed with Mamie that he had done about all he could to prosecute the 2 men. Mamie and her group left the courtroom before the verdict came in. At the time I had no idea why. But now I know that she could tell what the result would be from the looks on the whites' faces. Dad and I stayed in the courthouse. All the segregationists in the state of Mississippi were not going to keep us from hearing the verdict. It took the jury a little over an hour to decide Bryant and Milam's fate, not guilty. We were stunned and left with a sense of hopelessness that there was no justice for a black man in Mississippi if the case had anything to do with a white person. Dad said that no matter what he said or did, the white jurors were going to free those men. His testimony, an eyewitness account of the kidnapping, meant nothing to them. Dad said that he had heard it said that a black man's life meant nothing in Mississippi. Now he knew what they said was true. He had tasted firsthand the plight of the black man. What he saw crushed him. As for me, I was enraged and embittered by the verdict. I saw for the first time the evil that was in the heart of the segregationists. Even after 50 years, prejudice of the whites of Mississippi against the blacks is still baffling to me. Some things in the world have changed for the better, but far too many of these inequities remain. Needless to say, the death of Bobo and the acquittal of his murderers left a hole in my heart. What made it worse were the shouts of victory, glee, and sheer joy coming from the whites inside and outside of the courtroom. Bryant and Milam lit up cigars, folks hugged them and slapped them on the back. Even Sheriff Strider was pleased with the verdict. As we were walking to our car, we could only look back at them all, realizing that even after this brutal murder we were still alone. There was no one to help us. Even the whites who were incensed by the murder did nothing. They didn't want to get involved. I felt defeated, not by Milam and Bryant, but by the justice system of Mississippi.